Sometimes, the darkest secrets don't hide in shadows, they sit right across the dinner table. It was a quiet, ordinary morning in the small town of Rockford. The air was still, the coffee smelled fresh, and neighbors waved as they usually did. Nothing seemed unusual, until one call shattered that calm forever. 911, what's your emergency? A shaky male voice broke through. It's my wife, she's not breathing. I think she's dead. The man on the phone was Dan Howard, a soft-spoken, respected family man, or at least, that's what everyone thought. His wife, Kendi, was found lying motionless in their bedroom, the sheets twisted, her skin pale, her body still warm. At first glance, it looked like a tragic accident, maybe a medical emergency, maybe a heart failure. But soon, the truth began to peel away like old paint, revealing something far darker beneath. When the police arrived, Dan seemed anxious, pacing, avoiding eye contact. We were just talking last night, he told them. She said she felt dizzy. I thought she was fine. Then, she wasn't. The story sounded rehearsed. The officers noticed small details that didn't quite fit. There were scratches on Kendi's arms, and a faint mark around her neck, something you couldn't miss under proper light. The paramedics exchanged glances but said nothing. They took photos, bagged evidence, and quietly called the detective unit. By noon, the peaceful neighborhood had turned into a media circus. Reporters gathered outside the Howard home, whispering rumors. Had there been a fight? Was Dan hiding something? Everyone in town knew Dan and Kendi as the perfect couple. He was a hard-working construction supervisor, she was a loving mom who volunteered at the local school. Together, they seemed like the image of small-town happiness. But behind the walls of their suburban home, a storm had been brewing for months. Friends later told police that Kendi had become distant. She'd confided in a friend that she felt trapped, that Dan had a temper. He wasn't physically violent, but his words cut deep. He was controlling, jealous, and unpredictable. Sometimes I feel like I'm living with a stranger, she'd once said. The police started digging into their life. What they found would change everything. In Dan's phone records, detectives found searches from the night before Kendi's death, things like, how to make someone pass out, how long does it take for oxygen loss, and, what happens if you strangle someone in sleep. It was chilling. When detectives confronted him, Dan insisted those searches weren't his. Maybe Kendi was the one searching that. She wasn't well mentally. She was anxious, paranoid. But the timestamps matched the hours he was awake, alone in the living room. The autopsy report arrived days later. The coroner ruled asphyxiation, meaning, Kendi had been suffocated. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle that pointed to an intruder. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. And the only person home that night was Dan. When the officers came to arrest him, Dan didn't fight. He just said one sentence that made everyone uneasy. She shouldn't have pushed me that far. At trial, prosecutors painted a clear picture, a man who'd grown tired of his marriage, a man desperate for control, and a man who let his anger become deadly. They revealed that just weeks before Kendi's death, Dan had secretly taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy in her name. When asked why, he claimed, I just wanted to make sure our kids would be okay if something happened. But the investigators found something darker. The paperwork showed Kendi's signature had been forged. The jury gasped. Kendi's family sat in the courtroom, tears streaming down their faces. They'd lost their daughter, their sister, their friend, and now they were listening to her killer act like it was all a misunderstanding. Dan kept his face cold. No remorse. No emotion. And yet, the defense wasn't giving up easily. They argued Kendi had depression. They suggested she may have harmed herself, that Dan was simply panicked and confused. But the physical evidence told a different story. When the prosecutor displayed photos of Kendi's bruises, the courtroom went silent. The marks were consistent with manual strangulation. The jury saw the fingerprints. The pressure marks. The truth. The silence in that courtroom was heavy. Every eye was on Dan as the prosecutor's voice cut through the air. "Mr. Howard, did you love your wife?" He hesitated. His jaw tightened. "Of course I did." But the jury saw what he didn't say, the flicker of resentment, the lack of grief. The evidence was brutal. Investigators found a pillowcase with microscopic traces of Kendi's DNA and fibers matching the bedding. They discovered surveillance footage from a nearby gas station, Dan buying sleeping pills, late that same night. He'd crushed them into her tea, detectives said, then waited until she fell asleep. For weeks, the trial unfolded detail by detail, text messages, bank statements, arguments overheard by neighbors. Kendi's best friend testified that just 2 days before her death, she'd whispered, "If something happens to me, promise you'll tell them it wasn't an accident." When the jury heard that, several members wiped away tears. Dan's defense tried one last move. They brought in a psychologist to claim Dan acted in a moment of emotional blindness. But that excuse couldn't erase the planning, the searches, or the forged signature. After 5 long hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The judge asked, "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman nodded. "We find the defendant, Daniel Howard, guilty of first-degree murder." A collective breath filled the room, half relief, half sorrow. Dan's expression barely changed. He stared at the floor as the sentence was read, life in prison without the possibility of parole. But what came next stayed with everyone there. Kendi's mother stood and addressed him directly. Her voice trembled but carried strength. "You took our daughter, but you'll never take her spirit. She lives in her children, in every memory you couldn't erase. And one day, when you sit alone in that cell, you'll hear her voice. You'll remember what you did." The courtroom was silent again. Even the guards looked shaken. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters spoke about another case of hidden domestic violence. But for Kendi's family, there were no headlines big enough to explain the hole left behind. In the months after the trial, neighbors said the Howard house felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by guilt. The swing in the backyard never moved again, the garden wilted. A once happy home had become a silent monument to what anger can destroy. Kendi's children went to live with her parents. They still ask about their mother, why she's not coming home. Her mother tells them stories about how kind Kendi was, how she laughed loudly and loved deeply. She wants them to remember their mom not for how she died, but for how she lived. And Dan, he spends his days in a small gray cell. Prison officials say he rarely talks, rarely writes, barely eats. Some nights, they say, he wakes up shouting her name. Maybe guilt, maybe regret. Or maybe the echo of a life he destroyed. But behind every tragic case like this, there's a lesson that goes beyond the courtroom: love shouldn't hurt. Relationships built on fear or control never stay hidden forever. If you ever sense that something feels wrong, speak up. Help someone. Save someone. Because silence, the kind that filled Kendi's house that morning, can be deadly. And maybe that's the hardest part to accept: monsters don't always lurk in the dark. Sometimes, they live right beside us, smiling across the dinner table. If you've stayed with this story till now, thank you for listening. True crime cases like this remind us that behind every headline, there's a family, a life, a lesson. What happened to Kendi could happen anywhere, but awareness can save lives. Stay curious, stay cautious, and always remember, sometimes the truth hides in plain sight.